Okay, Screencast, chapters 4 and 5. I believe this is part 4 and should be our final part. We left off talking about compositional layouts, and vertical composition is what we're looking at here. So if you remember the vertical line, that line that's straight up and down, so this portrait is a good example. And again, this is another example of artwork that is done by Chuck Close. Chuck Close, we talked about the every hair, every pore. He did everything really highly detailed. This piece is actually shown on a grid pattern, so it's patches of color inside each square, and this was done after he was paralyzed. So he's still keeping the tradition of the realism, but in a different way. Now, horizontal composition, dealing with that horizon line here, so a landscape piece of artwork is the best example for this. And a diagonal composition, we look at that diagonal line. Remember, it has the feeling of excitement and movement. So this Cream of Wheat Cowboy by N.C. Wyeth is a really good example of that strong diagonal composition. Now, a complex composition is the final one, and when we're looking at this, it's any combination of two or more. So a vertical, a horizontal, or a diagonal. This one sort of has the combination of all of them. We have a strong horizontal line there in the center. Then we have the verticals going up around the center portion there. And then we have this wonderful arch that's framing it all, which you could say it's like the diagonals. This Raphael School of Athens will be the example of the complex composition. You'll definitely see this on your exam. Now, the illusion of depth, how do we get that? To create on a flat surface the illusion of three-dimensional space, we can use a technique called overlapping. This particular image is a really good example of dancers overlapping in the moonlight. Now, one of the simplest ways, like I said, is creating the illusion of depth is overlapping. So, something in front of something else. Now, position is another way we can show that depth. Now, this is showing spatial depth by placement in a composition. I'm sure you see the figure in the lower half of the left-hand side of the composition, but look into the right towards the middle part of the composition, you see another figure. So that's all about position. Now, some standard compositional layouts. Here's another listing. We have quadrant, sequential, asymmetrical, and golden section. And there you see an illustration of each of those. So we're going to look at the definition of quadrant. It is a simple composition that is created by the change in values from light to dark. There is no equal amounts of light. So we have white on one side of the composition, black on the other, and the gray tones go in between. Now, sequential is simply a dynamic composition that is reliant on rhythms. So we have big, little, big, little, big, little when it comes to stripes. That's that rhythm. So that's the sequential composition. Now, asymmetrical, we go back to those different types of balance. It's also referred to as a dynamic balance. It's that weight distribution. Why is symmetrical not on this list? Because it's not a preferred. Symmetrical tends to sometimes be what we think of as boring. So therefore, the composition that has the weight distribution that is more dynamic, like asymmetrical, is more aesthetically pleasing. Now, the golden section. The golden section is another compositional layout. We also call it the rule of thirds. So basically, the rule of thirds, the golden mean, the mean, these are all the same thing. It's a system of proportions that was developed by the Greeks in which sections of a line or a shape are related to one another according to an ideal. So what necessarily proportionately feels right. We have it inherently pleasing and satisfying. So if we were to take a blank piece of paper and to divide it into thirds horizontally and vertically, those intersections where that happens are considered to be the golden section. If we had a line that went from point A to point B, equal to 1. At 0.618 of that line is what we would consider to be the golden section. We find it in nature. Here we see it in the nautilus shell. And famous artists have used it throughout the history of time. This is an example by El Greco, but some other examples of artists like Mondrian we looked at, both the kind of grid pattern we looked at for the triad color scheme, the red, yellow, and blue, that's the Mondrian. And then there's Tintoretto and Rubens also use this. This is the last slide of this section.